everybody for coming to actually our first event of the summer. We're going to have events this summer. So I'm Lori Taylor Blitz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Beaver Island Historical Society. As I mentioned, we have right now 4 people on Zoom joining us from various locations. So hi to my Zoom audience. Tonight we're going to talk about Dendroarchaeology. That was quite the turn to learn, and I can spell it. So tonight we welcome Jim Speers and Matt Bekker, and let's see, I know one of you is from Brigham Young University, and you are from
Indiana State University.
Hoosiers. So Indiana State University, he is from there. They were on the island in 2019, and they did collect some core samples, and I'll let them explain to you what their process is and how they use their research. It's fascinating stuff. So without further ado, come on up, and I'm going to dim the lights. I'm not sure that my Zoom, I'm going to move you guys so you can see the screen.
There's a remote here for
No.
The Zoom people will see.
That's over my head, right?
The Zoom people will not be able to see the
Did I mess
screen.
you
I
up?
didn't think about that. So, let me move you guys. Okay. And I'll kill the lights. Thank you, Tracy.
Did that turn on?
Yes.
Is that enough?
That's about as good as we could, I think.
And how do I work this remote? I figured out the volume.
It looks like it's going to work for the
Is it for the brightness?
projector.
Is that just for the projector?
You might have to slide the screens for me.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. And we've got the crew from CMU, so it's nice to see you all here too. So we've got biologists in the house as well as historians. So I'm Jim Speer. I'm a professor of geography and geology at Indiana State University. And most of what I do is dendrochronology. So I wanted to start off talking a little bit about what dendrochronology is, what we can do with it. And then Matt is going to give us a little bit of history of the dendroarchaeology that he's done. And we're going to talk about the research specifically that we've done here on Beaver Island. So we'll give you a whole suite of things. Starting off actually on that last slide, we'd like to thank Owen Niles, correct?
Yep, Niles.
Niles, get the pronunciation right, for bringing us to Beaver Island. So he contacted me about 3 years ago and mentioned these Mormon structures and the Mormon logs here on Beaver Island with some interest in getting these dated. So Matt and I came out in 2019 and did a little bit of research then. Of course, we hoped to come back last summer and that didn't work out. But we were able to make it back this summer and continue our work. So we'll talk about all of that work together. So starting off with dendrochronology, there's a lot that we can do with it. Anytime you've got a tree with rings in there, we can take samples from those trees and date their records, date their history. We can look at the climate that comes out of the trees. A lot of what I do is look at the ecology that comes out of the trees. So I can tell past fire history, insect outbreaks, many different things. This is a bristlecone pine tree, which is the oldest living thing. Individual trees grow to be over 5,000 years in age, so we can pick up these old samples and look at that climate record for 5,000 years. We can also date those records through time, date them against the chronology of old wood versus living wood, and extend that even further back in time. So this is in the White Mountains in California. It's a little washed out. Most of the trees that you see in that view are 3,000 years old. So again, we can get back to this long-term history. This is an amazing forest at 10,000 feet elevation. Next slide, Matt. So this tree, with bristlecone pine at 10,000 feet growing on dolomite rock, this tree died 3,000 years ago. It had lived for 4,000 years. And again, piecing this record together, we can go back then 7,000 years in time, looking at this climatic history from the White Mountains in California. Next slide.
How did you date the 4,000 years?
How do we date the 4,000 years in this tree?
You said it died 1,000 years ago?
3,000 years ago. So, right, if we have small pieces of wood through time, we can start off with modern samples, match in older and older samples working back through time, and we can figure out what that gap is. We can tell that this tree was living, say, 3,000 years ago, it died at that time, and we can tell that gap. I've got a graph showing this kind of, it's what we call cross-dating, to start off with a modern day and cross-date that back from time. So you need that wood to go through that entire time period. As we do dendroarchaeology, as we're trying to do here, and structures from the 1800s, we need the modern chronology to date those samples again. So we need a modern record of trees coming up till today, so that we can take that entire history back and say this log was cut in 1860. Next slide. So a lot of people ask about the giant sequoia trees. These are the largest volume trees in the world, so we oftentimes think they might be the oldest. These trees, probably maximum is about 3,000 years in age. Most of them about 2,000 for these massive trees. And go on to the next slide. This is a class of students that I took out there. 10 students in what we call a cat face in one of these giant sequoia trees. Giant sequoia is well adapted to fire, so fire comes through frequently and it needs fire to regenerate, to clear out the forest floor so the seeds can germinate and the trees to survive. And with the next slide, we take samples out of these trees, a little bit hard to see in this one, but these are fire scars in 1114. Pretty much every 7 years or so, we have these fires buried in the wood of the tree. So we can take those old sections off of dead stumps that were cut in the early 1900s and look at this history, as long as we can date that to the modern day. So just showing a little bit about these trees. So this is a tip-up mound of giant sequoia. So they are huge trees, but they don't go very deep. So the tip-up mound is just a couple feet across, and they can fail from windstorms that come through. Next slide. And then, so giant sequoia grove, this is me for scale, giant sequoia, that's but massive trees, and you can see these fire scars that come up and burn through the tree. So with dendrochronology, we can look at this ecology in the forest. We can look back at that fire history going back even 1,000 years in these trees. And we worked with Sequoia National Park with this to talk to them about fire as a natural part for them. So my master's thesis advisor started working in giant sequoia in the 1980s, and at that time there was no giant sequoia regeneration for a couple decades. And after studying this, we realized that sequoia needed fire, and we started putting fire in there, prescribed burn every 10 years, and now today giant sequoia regenerates. And there was a massive fire in California, I think it was 2 summers ago, that came into this grove, and because they'd been burning it regularly, the fire just died down when I came to this area, and that also helps protect the grove. So a lot of modern day fire history, fire management that we do today is from dendrochronology, from knowing this long-term history about how these trees interact with fire. So around the world, they're really interesting trees. This is the kauri tree from New Zealand. This is 15 dendrochronologists down here for scale. But these are really massive trees. And if you think of Lord of the Rings filmed in this area, these could easily be Ents. They're the most charismatic tree I've ever seen. Go to the next slide. So this is the canopy of that tree, the top of the tree. So just a really gnarly old tree. These grow to be about 2,000 years in age for the oldest ones. Sadly, most of New Zealand has been logged, so you're left with these small 50-acre kind of postage stamps of forest that are left today. And actually, oddly enough, they're mostly planting Monterey pine throughout New Zealand. So they're taking a California tree and planting it there for timber, and they have these beautiful trees, most of which are logged out. The difficulty for dendrochronology is to do tree rings in the tropics. So because the tropics don't have much seasonal change, the trees don't shut down and don't stop growth. We did some dendrochronology in the Dominican Republic where we went to 10,000 feet elevation, and there was enough dry season that the trees would shut down, and we were able to do some dendrochronology there. These are Pinus occidentalis trees. We're going through the lowlands in the Dominican Republic. And these trees are putting on 4 to 5 rings per year. Every time it rains, there's growth. When it doesn't rain, the trees stop, and it just does this pulse of growth. And we can't date that with dendrochronology. Go to the next slide. And then the wood is very difficult as well. So we have these pinching rings, again, wood from Dominican Republic. So in this case, they're forming rings, but then you'll have 5 rings that completely pinch out as you go around the circumference. So it makes it difficult to date. Well, the next slide, this is a site called Canuco del Diablo, Cornfield of the Devil. This is at 10,000 feet elevation in Dominican Republic. And because it's such a dry site, and the trade winds actually keep the clouds to lower elevation, we don't get a lot of precipitation on these sites. So these trees were actually putting on annual rings, and we could build a 300-year chronology from this area and look at the sea surface temperature from the Caribbean and reconstruct that over time. So look at that long-term climate. This is in Zambia, so one of the frontiers for dendrochronology. In science, it's interesting to think about where the bounds are for dendrochronology. There's 2 African dendrochronologists in the world, in Africa. So 2 Africans that actually do dendrochronologies. So Matt and I are hoping to go there on our sabbatical and teach a dendrochronology field school to do capacity building, to train more African researchers to do dendrochronology. So this is the Miambo forest in Zambia. The trees actually do put on rings, but they're very difficult. The wood is very difficult to work with. But we can start building chronologies in Africa as well. There's just a scatter of chronologies. So to talk a little bit about the principles of dendrochronology, how we do this work. So the trees are going to be putting on small rings, wide rings that depend upon the climate. So it depends upon where the tree is growing about what it's responding to. So if it's growing at high elevation, temperature controls its growth. This tree, this is actually a sketch of a cross-section from wood in Arizona, and in that case, drought is controlling its growth. So with small rings, there's not much rainfall. Large rings, there's a lot of rainfall. This part is called the early wood. This part, the darker part, is called the late wood, where the tree thickens its cell walls at the end of the growing season. And with that, you have a very distinctive ring pattern, where this is 1 year, 1 year, 1 year. And you do get these things like false rings in there, where in this case there's a drought in June to July. The tree actually started to shut down because it was so dry. When we get a little bit more rainfall, it started up growing again. So there's quite a bit of variability in there, and we have to use our skills as dendrochronologists, do cross dating to match up the pattern of wide and narrow rings to make sure that we have every ring represented in there. That we, when we say this ring is a certain year, we're absolutely confident that that's correct. Nice. So this variability in growth is tied into an old concept from the 1800s called Liebig's Law and the minimum. And this is the basis actually for all the fertilizer that we use in agriculture. Liebig realized that if you have nitrogen as the controlling agent in agricultural fields, if you add more nitrogen, that increases growth till you hit the next limiting factor that could be sulfur as a micronutrient. So that most limiting growth is what we're recording in those tree rings. So it could be temperature, it could be rainfall, it could be nutrients in the soil, and whatever is limiting that tree is the tree ring chronology, the record that we build up over time. So this is showing the principle of cross-dating. So when we sample modern trees, the way that we build the chronology, so back to your question originally, we'll sample 20 trees in the forest, 2 cores per tree, so we've got 40 samples, and we know when we cord the tree, so that's our anchor in time. That's when we start this work. We can match up those 40 cores against each other, going back with wide, narrow rings, and with that we can be confident that we have all the rings represented. We've got all the years represented by matching up that pattern and make sure that we have everyone in there. So then we can take a sample out of a stump that might have been cut sometime in the 1900s, and with that modern chronology, we can match up the pattern of wide, narrow rings against that and date when that was cut. And we can go back further in time, so this bridges us back into these older structures like we're looking at here. And then when we take samples out of these log cabins, we can tie that into our chronology and figure out when those logs were cut. So when we're in a cabin, we'll take every beam that we can get to with an outside surface that looks like it had bark or some outer surface, we can take a sample through that, and if we have this plateau of dates, we can tell when those logs were cut and put into that cabin. And that's most of the work that we're trying to do here. So that's the principle of cross-dating. That's what really makes dendrochronology a science. So how many people have picked or gone out to a stump and counted rings on it before? Yeah, probably most people in here. We do that, like we take out Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and they do that technique. Foresters have been doing that for hundreds of years, and they do that to tell a tree's age, which is very useful. But it doesn't give us the whole set of information. We really need cross-dating to demonstrate the accurate age of each one of those. And you can imagine to be able to date this deadwood, we have to have this accurate modern chronology going up to the present. So I mentioned a bit of what we do with dendrochronology, but these are all the applications that we use. So dendroarchaeology is what we're trying to do here, archaeological reconstruction. Most of what dendrochronology is climate reconstruction. With these trees going back thousands of years, this is where we can look back fairly well, back 2,000 years in time, to look at northern hemisphere climate, so that we can put our modern day climate change into perspective. We can look at meteorological records. They go back to 1890 pretty well across North America. But with Dendrochronology adding 2,000 years on that, we can look at those long-term patterns. So it really helps to put it into context. With Dendroarchaeology, we use tree rings to look at fire history, insect outbreaks, stand establishment. Dendrogeomorphology, we can look at landscape changes. Anything that scars a tree or kills a tree, we can record with Dendrochronology if we have the record. So we can look at landslide events and date when those events occur with Dendrogeomorphology. Dendrochemistry, if a tree is picking up contaminants in the soil, we can date when that started happening as well. So the trees pick up everything that's in the water and they store some of those chemicals in the ring. So we can look at the chemistry of the rings and we can figure out when that contamination started. Dendrohydrology, we can look at stream flow reconstructions or water table changes. We're now getting into isotopic analysis, so we can look at a finer resolution into dendroclimate, how the trees are picking up carbon-16 versus carbon-18, and what that is telling us about the climate around it. And kind of a new direction that we're going is something called Sclero Chronology, and I threw this in for the CMU folks. We are talking a lot about wood, but bony structures also put on annual rings. So when we pick up a clam or a mussel shell, they're also putting on annual rings. And we can use the same cross-staining techniques in those features, so we can look at the shells of mussels and tell how old these organisms are. So go to the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about sclerochronology. So some of the older things that we've dated, another part, so this is a gooey duck shell. And gooey duck gets to be over 150 years in age. So again, we can see that in the shell. But from fish, they have an otolith in their ear, this ear bone that gives them their balance. So that puts on a calcium carbonate concretion each year. So we can take that otolith out, which is destructive sampling, but we can cross-section that and it puts on rings just like a tree does. So we find that rockfish are over 100 years old, freshwater drum at about 70 years old, some freshwater mussels at more than 100 years old. Gooey duck, so if you're eating clam chowder, you're oftentimes eating, the clam that you're eating is sometimes over 100 years in age. It's pretty amazing. The oldest living animal that we've documented is Arctica islandica, which is a clam in the Arctic that's 510 years old. So that's the oldest animal that we've documented doing this. We can also look at tropical corals. Some corals will put on growth layers instead of just like a horn coral. So we can core through those, and the oldest one that we found so far is 300 years in age. Next slide. Hope this one shows up very well. This is a fish otolith. You can't quite see it, but if you can see the computer screen there, you can probably actually see it better there, but there are lines on here, and click through a couple of clicks there on that. So we can see that it was established in 1933. We can date through this axis coming down through here, and then we can see that it was captured in 1989. And again, it's hard to see in here, but the width of the annual rings that it's putting on, the annual growth layers, are dependent upon its environment. And it turns out when we're looking at sclerochronology, it's very closely tied to sea surface temperature. We actually get a much better correlation to sea surface temperature than our trees correlate to water or atmospheric temperature. So we can do a lot with sclerochronology as well. Next slide. So this is where I transition over to Matt. We're going to get a little bit more into dendroarchaeology, but there's a lot of different things we can do with dendroarchaeology. We can look at construction dates, which is what we're trying to do here. But we can go further than that and look at construction practices. What wood did they use to put into that structure? Or if we know even the date of construction, we can even tell if they cut logs and stored them or cured them for 2 years before putting them into the structure. So depending upon the outside information that we know, we can tell more information for construction practices. This is a culturally modified tree. So in the Southwest, Native Americans would make axe cuts at knee height and above head height, peel the bark off the tree, and probably eat the inner cambium as a starvation food. So we can date these scars and tell when Native Americans were using that landscape. We can even date musical instruments. A professor from University of Ohio brought me a cello and wanted to date this cello to confirm its date. It was an Amati instrument, which is before Stradivarius, and we were able to date the rings on that, and it does date to the late 1600s, like 1670s, which is when Amati would have been using this wood to build these instruments. So anything with 3 rings on it that has enough rings, usually 50 rings, and we have a modern chronology, we can date those structures and start to interpret what was happening. Next slide, and switching over to Matt.
See, the map turned out really well, so.
I Just to get on the computer screen really.
Yes, right, everybody can just look at the computer screen. Right. So, yeah, I was wondering if that might be either your computer or projector.
I think it's the projector. Do you have that remote again? I might be able to change the contrast.
Brightness. So it's kind of a transition into what Jim and I have been doing 2 years ago and this year. I thought it would be interesting to tell you a little bit about a related story. So you all know King Strain. He has a connection with Brigham Young, namesake of my university. They were both together here in Nauvoo as part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which most people know as Mormons. But James Strain took his group, broke off from the main body of the church and headed north. Brigham Young took his group out to the west to Utah. So that was in 1844. Strain, first of all, went to Bordy, Wisconsin, modern-day Burlington, outside of Milwaukee. Was there for just a few years, but found better opportunities right here on Beaver Island, settled here in 1848, and was assassinated in 1856. So, as we're thinking about the time period, what's happening here, keep in mind what's happening with Brigham Young, the Strainites, as they're often called, and maybe the Youngites, who went west. And so I want to tell you a little bit about a project that I've done in Salt Lake City, and then we'll come back to what's happening in Beaver Island. Next one. So I did some work several years ago on the Salt Lake Tabernacle. If you've ever visited Salt Lake City, this is one of the more popular tourist areas. Mormon Tabernacle Choir has performed here before they built another structure across the street. But this was the structure as it was under construction from 1863 to 1867. And this is an example, as Jim mentioned, one of the purposes for Dendroarchaeology is to determine the date of the structure. When were the trees cut down to build that structure? What's the construction date? But another purpose is to, as Jim mentioned, just decipher construction practices. This one we know when it was built, there's no doubt about that. 1863 to 1867, completed in 1867. But the historians who wanted me to do this work were wondering if maybe the wood that was used here might have been recycled or repurposed from other structures. Next slide. So here's a look at the tabernacle from the outside, that dome structure. Next one. And an older photo. Just a look at the dome structure. And then we're going to go inside and take a look at the tabernacle. So this is the inside. Originally there was no balcony and there was no organ here. There was no raised seating. So the original structure was very simple, but then they added this balcony and they added this raised seating in the pulpit and the very large and very heavy organ. Next slide. And this is what it looks like underneath all of that. This is what we call unreinforced masonry. Just breaking, you could literally walk out to somebody's and take a break and pull it out. And this is what that organ is sitting on the far end of the tabernacle. So this one underwent a seismic upgrade. These steel beams were actually from a previous upgrade, but it needed much more of an upgrade. And so all this work was being done, and they were going to replace all of the unreinforced masonry foundation with steel reinforced concrete, and replace all of these Douglas fir beams with steel beams, which is great for the engineers and great for the people who want to see that building stay standing, which all of us. But at least purist historians start freaking out when they hear about all this wood being taken out and being thrown into some museum or maybe thrown in a landfill somewhere. So they wanted me to come in and identify if any of those logs might have been used for previous structures, because they would have even greater historical significance, and maybe they could keep them in their proper place, even if they're just kind of bolted back to the ceiling there rather than in some museum somewhere in a landfill. So that was the goal. We know when this building was constructed, but they wanted to know, could this have been used for previous structures? 1863 to 1867, remember they went out there in 1847, so this is 20 years have gone by before this building was constructed, so there's a lot of opportunities for repurposing or recycling of timber.
And was wood fairly rare?
Yes. Here's an inside the tabernacle look. If you've seen a postcard or something, or maybe been there, that's the organ. It's been expanded, so a lot of weight there. Yes, it's dry, it's a desert, timber is scarce. Here's the foundation, also unreinforced masonry. Again, it was all replaced by steel reinforced concrete. Next one. So there was a lot of recycling of timber going on, not only in Utah, but in other areas. And I'm showing you this cabin because my great-great-grandfather lived there in northern Arizona. You can see the curvature right here is the hull of the boat. And this was documented in a book that they had a chunk of wood sitting in the Colorado River. There's a ruined boat. Hey, that'll go in my cabin. It'll fit all right here. So timber was so scarce here that they're pulling boats out of the water to build their cabins. So recycling timber there in northern Arizona. And then also specifically documented for the Salt Lake Tabernacle. This is a temporary bowery. These are the kinds of things that were constructed from 1847 up to 1863 when the Salt Lake Tabernacle was started. There's actually an old tabernacle here, temporary bowery here. So the idea was that those temporary boweries might have been used with timber that was then repurposed, recycled into the Salt Lake Tabernacle. And if that were true, then, hey, it's not just trees from 1863, but it's trees from 20 years older that have even greater historical significance. The whole purpose being, wow, this is now something we really need to take care of, and we have an argument for maybe a little bit more work to document and take care of these timbers before it's all thrown away or thrown in the museum or whatever. Next one, okay, so washed out paper here. This is one I published a bunch of years ago with a student. Our objectives were to determine the cutting dates for the timbers in the tabernacle. The tabernacle was built, but could those logs have been used in some previous structures? And that kind of takes us to our purpose for being here, but before I get back to that, I'm just going to take a break.
I appreciate it. Spend some time.
Yeah, I think it's worth it, so you can actually see what's going on the screen there.
Up here. All right, any advice, color, temperature, heating? That's kind of
The problem is that
The
window.
window, yeah, so the sun is so bright.
You need a shade on that window.
So we're just going to wait a couple hours till the sun's out.
Refreshing.
Try different color temperature. That could help.
Maybe help them.
Well, when you choose it, look like right or left. I don't think so.
Zero.
It might help to tilt the screen a little away from the window, because the light from the window is.
Yeah, twisted a little bit clockwise. Yeah.
It's lost its resolution though, too, so.
It's a little better, yeah.
All right. Matt and I will just do more interpretive dance.
Yes. That's what you came here for.
So that brings us to our work here for the last 4 days, actually. So we wanted to tell you a little bit about our updated work, and then Matt's going to finish off with the results that we have from what we did 2 years ago. So this is actually a map that Owen put together, and we sampled 4 structures here. So this is on Sloptown Road, and we start off with the I'm not going to remember the
John Gillespie house.
John Gillespie house over here, and then we did the Bonner Ruin. We started calling it a house, and so we started sampling it for a little while. You'll see in a little bit. Now we did the early house, and then finally the O'Donnell house. So these structures on East Side Road, and then these structures on Sloptown Road are the 4 that we sampled over the last 2 days, 3 days that we've been here. Next slide. So this is the John Gillespie house. It's a great structure, apparently recently purchased, and some interest in remodeling it, reworking it. But this is what the structures look like that we're dealing with when they're in a really good condition. So this one has a good roof on it, so it's been protected. We mapped this out, and I think we had 14 beams from top to bottom, and we looked through the surface to try to find the outside edge of the wood. So bark would be excellent. If there's beetle galleries that were in the cambium of the tree, we can tell that that's the outside surface. We also look for something called the waney edge. So the curvature, if you think about a tree that's been cut, it has this curve on the outside. So we want to find that outside surface, because if we core through that, we know the year that that log was cut. If we core through a weathered surface, and you can imagine that this is built in the 1800s, there's a lot of weathering. If we core through a weathered surface, a lot of that wood has fallen off, and we don't get the outside data. So our whole piece of data, the 1 year that we're looking for, is that outermost ring that's on the wood. Yeah, Owen?
I was just gonna say that if the log has been squared, you can't go through the squared edge. Then, which
Right.
are usually what face you on a cabinet.
Yeah, so these beautiful cabins have been well put together, right? So they square off the edges. So when we're looking at this, most of the surface that you're looking at is a squared off plane. They took an adze and took off quite a bit of wood, making that square structure and also fitting these together well and then chinking in between. So there's a lot of wood removed in this process. So we're kind of looking for the needle in the haystack. We're looking on these edges, on the top and on the bottom, to try to find this little area of preserved bark or outermost component of the tree. And then once we take a sample out, we document it. So with a whiteboard, we're taking a picture of where that sample came from, the sample ID on there, and we're sampling every single beam that we can in this structure. So Matt has a great story of where he sampled a structure, and then he was like, oh, there's 2 beams up top, maybe I won't get those. Oh, go ahead and get them. He got those 2, and they had different dates than everything else in the cabin. So those might have been decayed and added on later, and that's part of the story that we're looking for. So we get as much of the sample as we can from these. Part of that is controlled by what is exposed. This building is perfectly exposed. We can see every beam in there. We can go inside the house and also look at the structure inside the house and take samples. Not everything is that well exposed. So next slide. So this is the John Gillespie house that we sampled 3 days ago. There's a sign outside that says 1858. So this is one thing that we do in Dendroarchaeology is we can tell whether or not this is the case. Was this structure built in 1858? I mentioned that most of what I do is dendroecology. In the past, I actually avoided dendroarchaeology because we've got 2 options. We can either confirm what you already know, which isn't all that exciting, or we can disprove what you think is true. And people don't like that. So what we oftentimes find is that when there are dates on things, we oftentimes find it's a generation younger than what people expect it to be. So that's often disappointing if that's the case. But we'll hear how our previous ones went when that's a teaser from Matt. So then we go through and document. So again, we're taking pictures of where we took the sample. We can go back and see that specific sample. We also plug it up with just a dowel rod, really just for appearance sake, and that's going to weather and you won't even notice when it's there. The owner of the house came out partway through our sampling, and we were showing him where we sampled, and he was saying you wouldn't even have noticed that when we took those samples out. Next slide. In the back of the John Gillespie house, we weren't even thinking about these when we arrived, but there's these 2 barns that are out there as well. And I don't think the present owner is that interested in keeping them around. They're quite run down, but this is a great resource for us. Looking at these 2 barns, I don't have the specific log picture, but there's this great spiral beam that's in there. And when the trees get really old, they get this spiral grain to them. So then we know that we're dealing with a very old log, and besides the dates that we can get from this, we can also push our chronology back in time. All the old wood, almost all the old wood on Beaver Island today, is actually in these structures. So if we want a long-term climate reconstruction, we can get that wood out of these structures. So that long history is useful to us as well. So we also took, so it's at the end of the day, we've cored everything we were supposed to core, and Matt and I are like, can we just get a couple cores out of this thing? So we got 2 beams on each of these structures. And as Matt was talking about the construction process, we can also look at, is the wood the same type of wood? Are they using cedar in the house and maybe something else back in the barn? So we can also look at some of that process.
You can see that spiral grain a little bit on that.
On this one here, you see some? Yeah.
Again, it's better looking.
So you can see how it kind of spirals down. If you see an old standing tree that has that spiral grain, it's an older tree. You can have a large tree that's very young, that grows very fast, it doesn't get that spiral grain. And you should also look for large branches if you want an old tree. Next. So this is the John Early house. And Matt's family walking out there, we got to bring our families up here. So this is the John Early house, and most of this is actually covered on the outside, so we actually can't get to those lower beams. But the second story inside is completely open. So that's where we worked on this house. So all of our samples are from about here up on the structure. I'll make it a little lower, probably about here up. And we can sample those beams. Next slide, we'll bring you inside. So this is Owen, helped us with our field work. And you've got the beams, there's whitewash in here, so we're working around that. There's chinking that's in there as well, so between the beams, and that's where most of our curvature is. We try not to disturb anything in the houses as we're sampling, but we want to get those samples just above, just kind of on the top and bottom of the beams where we have that curvature. So we spend quite a bit of time looking around to find those beams. Another thing is, yeah, we couldn't see the main floor of the building, so end of the day, we're ready to go. It's like, can we get into the cellar and take a look around? We really like cellars, so we're cramped down there in the cellar and took these beams out. This one has beetle galleries all through it, so we know we have an outside surface. It's hard to see on here, but it's kind of like carving on the surface.
You didn't get the dead rabbit though.
I did not get the dead rabbit yet. Owen was just telling us about all the rabbits around there, and I went down and said, oh, I found one. It wasn't there anymore. And then you can see how this is hewn off, but you can see a little bit of the curvature here on the surface. So this is where we poured in here, and we were able to pour it straight through on that because it was a full ground. So we got actually 6 beams out of the cellar at the end of our day. Next slide. So then we went on to the John O'Donnell ruin. This is on Rose's property. Rose came out and visited us while we were pouring out there. We were very popular out there. There were 4 different groups that came out and talked to us while we were pouring this one. This is a great structure. I'd love to see it preserved. It's well held together compared to a lot of the things that we've seen. So as we're coring in here, I don't have close-ups of them, but beetle galleries on most of these beams, so we're able to get in and get those cores. We worked our way all the way around. Oftentimes they would have beams that go all the way across, and then they would cut them open and put the window in. So oftentimes it's the same beam coming across, but not always. So we had to check that out and see where these beams were and the best place to sample each one. Many of these have a cellar in the center as well, so we're doing a lot of our work from the outside. This one also is a great place for snakes. Striped, what was it?
Ribbon snake.
Ribbon snakes. So there were ribbon snakes falling off the building as we're going up to the sample. They were very fun. They did not eat at all, so we're fine. Next slide. This is just a hinge that's still left inside there, so it's a really beautiful piece that's just on, but I think it's the east side of the building. Next slide. So this is the John Bonner ruin. So this is in much more disrepair coming down. But again, you can see the beams, they're pretty well held up. The rest of the building, not as much, but we went through and again sampled every beam that we could. Next slide. This is Matt doing that work. So the actual work that we do, this is a guide that we hammer in there. So if you're taking a drill bit and trying to sample, this is a specially made German drill bit by a person named Pressler. And we can just use battery operated drills. We hammer this guide in there that keeps the drill bit from bouncing around as you're trying to start. If people have drilled before, you know it's hard to get a start on there. This guide keeps it in place so we can take a nice core. We put a Sharpie mark on the surface, and if that Sharpie mark is preserved, we have that outside ring. If it comes off and it's just plain wood, we know that we lost that outside date in that process. So then we drill up, which takes quite a bit. These batteries, we could probably get through about 4 beams if the batteries are doing well. And so we have, I think we brought 11 batteries with us for this work. Next slide. So this is over to Matt to tell you what we found from our 2019 sample.
Excuse me, Matt, these handouts show a lot of what you were just talking about, and they're kind of hard to see on the screen, so if you just want to pass those around.
Okay, so yes, what you really want to know is when did we find 2 years ago? I'm not going to tell you much. So this is, you are here, St. James Bay here, and a look at the Mormon print shop, which is one of the structures that we analyzed. Jump to the next one. So the reason we are here is because Owen, I guess, emailed us a few years ago, said that he'd been out working in his yard, and somebody said he had a really interesting house that was built with Mormon logs. And he wanted to find out if that was really true, and he'd known a little bit about the history of the area, and again, the James Strang connection after he left Nauvoo and Hawaii and came here. And again, one of the questions we often have is, what is the construction date of a given building? And this one was not exactly known, approximately, but sometime in the 1890s. So we had that construction date question, but also were there any repurposed Strangite logs? So after James Strang was killed, of course, the Strangite Mormons were run off the island, and in some cases, maybe, structures were just taken over. In some cases, maybe those structures were torn down, and the wood was repurposed. So not exactly the same reason as what we saw at the Salt Lake Tabernacle, where there isn't any timber, there's abundant timber, but if it's already there, it's already been hewn, it's already ready, you can repurpose that for more buildings. So what was the construction date, was the question here, and were there any samples that would date back to the Strenite period? What was the species, the species that was used here? One of the problems, as Jim mentioned, is accessibility of the timber. So you can see here, you couldn't access the timbers from the outside unless we tore off all of the siding, which we didn't want to do that. No one didn't want to do that. But we did have a couple places where you could access. Here, there was one on the porch. Inside, next sample, there were more. So there's that one on the outside I just showed you up in the attic. And there was also one other wall indoors that we were able to access. So we were able to get to a total of, well, I guess that'll come later in the results. We were able to get to a few of the timbers here, but that was one of the problems here. We'd like to be able to access as many of the timbers as possible to tell the full story, but we were able to get to at least a few here. Okay, next one. I'm sure you all know about Theodore Protar, whose real name is Friedrich Perot. Probably know a little bit about his history, a little bit of a local hero for the area, folk hero. And we were able to, although you can't really see that from here if you've ever been by this house, we couldn't access any of the logs on the outside here, but the other sides we could. The front porch here, as well as the other two sides, we were able to access the logs from the outside. And we were also able to access a lot of those logs from the inside. So we were able to get to most of the timbers here. This took a good day's worth of work just for this one. Originally built by for the Connolly family. I think I've got that misspelled, but construction, I've got two different historical records that I could see. One suggested 1858, one suggested, quote, about 1860. So we wanted to see if we could confirm that. Could this one have included any repurposed strenite logs? This one, the species was already at least theoretically known, white pine, and as I mentioned, most of the timbers were accessible. So next slide. This is the front porch, and on the other side you can see the logs are all exposed there. Fortunately, we were able to access a lot of these from the outside because upstairs bats like to visit and they'll smell it later in the afternoon. But, accessing from the outside here. And this was actually one of the better structures I've worked with in terms of the availability of these surfaces. A lot of times there's either too much chinking or they did too good of a job of matching up all the timbers and we just can't get to that outside edge. But we had a lot of overlapping edges here, and so we were able to get to a lot of these timbers. This was a nice structure to work with. Next one. And finally, right next door here, the print shop. Historical records, 1850. Right after the Stranites arrived here. Species is unknown. Of course, the Historical Society is here. And the question is this the only extant structure from the Strenite period? Or one of the bigger questions, and why I go back here this year, could there be any other structures that date back to that Strenite period? Okay, so those are the three structures we worked with 2 years ago. Next slide. Here's Jim Corey inside. Print shop, we weren't able to get to any of the timbers outside, but a lot of really nicely accessible timbers on the inside.
There were a bunch of timbers showing at the bottom of the building.
Yes.
When they cut off the old thing.
Right.
Were you able to
And
access?
they were actually out here in a pile, and so we actually took the chainsaw to those. It's just a whole lot easier than coring. So yeah, we do have some of those. A lot of them were probably replacement logs because the rings were, Jim was talking about the pattern of wide and narrow rings. It was wide from the plantation way. But there were some that are probably datable. We haven't gotten to those yet. So yeah, so those are interesting in that they were probably part of that structure that was built onto the back, not here, but over there, that was then cut away to make room for the structure. All right, next slide. This is just a little bit more detail on what Jim was telling you about. It's really rare that we get something this wonderful, where we have a huge chunk of bark there, and so we know we've got the outer ring, and so we will sometimes try to core right through that bark. If not, we'll just peel a little bit of that away and put that Sharpie mark in there so we know we've got the outside ring. Here's what that little painted Sharpie mark area, if that's preserved on our core, we know we haven't lost anything by the drill bit moving around. And you can also make out a little bit of the budo galleries here that Jim talked about. So we look for bark is ideal, then beetle galleries, then we just try to see if there's kind of a smooth rounded surface, an unaltered surface, maybe a little bit of that shiny patina on it that indicates that we've got an outer ring. That's really what we want to find. We always take notes. Yeah, we think we've got the outer ring, or no, we're not so sure, and that we can piece that together when we get back to the lab. Okay. Next slide. Here's what the samples look like. We secure those two wooden mounts in the field, so we take it out of the wall, put it right there so it's already secured. Clip or tape or tie those down and hold it all together while the glue is drying, and then we can sand that to be able to see the rings very clearly, and then match that floating chronology, if you will. They match with each other, but we have no idea how they're anchored in time. We'll find old trees that other people have sampled that have that most recent ring, so we sampled them in 2005 or 2015, and they go back far enough to overlap with the mid-1800s, and so we can then anchor these in time and find out what that outer ring is, and then suggest what the cutting date is for those timbers, and then suggest what the construction date is for the building. Okay, so results. So first of all, Owen's house, and that slide got cut off a little bit. We had 10 timbers. Now, 8 of those were either balsam fir or hemlock, and we've gone back and forth on this. Our first thought was hemlock. Then we not only looked at the rings, but actually did some thin sectioning and did some wood anatomy, which suggested balsam fir, but these are very large logs. If you ask me today, I'd say hemlock. In either case, the chronologies from the surrounding area, which you can't see this map at all. This is the Upper Peninsula, this is the UP, this is Beaver Island. And so not too far away, we did find a hemlock chronology that cross-dated correlated with these timbers quite well. So not too far away is hemlock. Here's our correlation. Anything above about a 0.3 or a 0.4 is good, statistically significant. If it was 1, people wouldn't believe us because that's perfection. And the real world doesn't work that way. So that is a very good correlation between what we're talking about here is the zig and zag, the wide and narrow rings of the reference chronology, the living trees that overlap with our trees, and the wide and narrow ring pattern matches up pretty well at 0.54.
Are you doing the matching visually in any way, or is that all manual work?
It's a little bit of both. So it's we measure the rings manually. There are some ways that you can measure the ring visually. Jim and I are both kind of old school, so we're mark the rings by hand and look through a microscope and kind of cross-date it that way. But it is
that works. I was going to ask if there are any other optics you use, so microscope.
absolutely. Yeah, these are all through a microscope. Some of these rings are big enough you can see them just with the naked eye. Yes, we use a binocular microscope to cross-date by hand first. We use that. Look for the pattern ourselves, then we look at it statistically, and then we look at it graphically. And all of those things have to match. If one of them doesn't look quite right, then we set it aside. We have some samples that we've had to set aside for some reason. Okay, so the chronology range, that is the timbers that came from Owen's house, date back to just before 1700. The first ring on the oldest tree in there dates back before 1700. And the outer ring on our samples was 1883. So this is the correlation between our samples from Owen's house and the living chronology. The correlation of just the 10 timbers within Owen's house is 0.63, so even higher. They correlate very well with each other, which makes sense. They all came from the same area. Now, the cutting dates are 1882 or 1883. But our interpretation of the construction date is in 1884. The reason for that is we had complete rings in 1883. Jim showed you examples of rings that have early wood and late wood. If that outer ring has all the early wood and it has the late wood on it, then that's a complete ring. What that means is summer was over, and so they probably weren't doing any building on Beaver Island after summer's over, right? Because summer ends, winter comes very quickly. So it probably would have been the next year. Maybe before the trees had started growing, but they cut those down and then built it in 1888.
And am I wrong, or don't they do a lot of lumbering in winter?
I know that happens where I'm from in Utah. So they would do a lot of.
Yeah, pretty much that's what it was all done here, because it's much easier to pull the timbers out.
Right, it's the same thing, they would actually,
Yeah.
they slide them down chutes in the mountains.
Yeah, so, yeah, so that would make a lot of sense.
Yes, right, exactly. Right. So, complete ring, and maybe they had done some cutting in 1882, but they definitely did some more cutting in 1883. Construction date, and all of the 10 agreed with each other, either 1882 or 1883. There wasn't a lot of variation there. So our interpretation is that this house was built in 1884, which does not overlap with the Strangling period. So this was not repurposed timber, this is all post-Strangling period.
But the historical record says that it was built in 1898, so.
1898. So this is really fun. Jim said either we confirm it or we say you're wrong, but this was we're wrong in the other direction,
Yeah.
which doesn't happen too often. This is actually an older building than
Not only was
we thought
it-
it was.
Not only did it not have Mormon logs in it, but it was 10 years older than the historical date, or the first registered date with the Charlotte County when it was registered as being a structure, so.
Right. Yeah, so that was kind of fun.
Yeah.
And that was even a little bit older. Okay. Yeah, next one. So, Protar House. Everything was white pine here, which agrees with historical records. It's always nice, except for the floor supports. There was some hardwood in there, really small timbers, hard to cross tape. We're not there yet on that. In this case, we were able to, so there are a lot of white pine chronology. A lot of people have sampled white pine throughout Michigan and other places. I had to go all the way to Ontario to find a chronology that matched with that. Don't know exactly why that is. Something about the microsite that those southern Ontario samples came from that matched well with the white pine in Protar House. And you notice that's not a fantastic correlation, but it's still statistically significant. It's enough to be confident about, and it looks good graphically. You can't tell that, but the red and the blue covariate. Okay, so good correlation between them. The white pine within the house itself also correlated very well. We're going all the way back to 1555 with the innermost ring of the oldest tree there, and out to 1860. We had cutting dates in 1859, cutting dates in 1860, again, complete ring 1860. So interpretation of the construction date is 1861, which is a few years later than even the National Register of Historic Places document says, about 1860. So a little bit younger than those historical records suggest. But hey, at least it's not a generation younger, which is often the case. Really, it's 50 years younger than I thought. But 1861 is our interpretation construction date. However, there were a few logs in there that dated farther back, had cutting dates, so coffin outer ring, that were earlier, one in 1853 and a couple in 1854. So contemporaneous with the Strangling period, might be recycled, might be repurposed timbers from the Strangling era. But some other timbers that we just didn't get cutting dates for. Okay, no needle galleries, no bark, and not a really great surface. So maybe a little bit of a hodgepodge, grabbing what you can to put this material together. But most of the cutting dates were 1859, 1860, complete rings 1860. Interpretation is 1861 for the construction date. And finally, the print shop. Of course, the best records for the print shop, 1850. All of the cutting dates. There was nothing earlier than 1847, nothing after 1849. They're all between 1847 and 1849. Again, complete rings in 1849. So construction date is 1850, and that matches the historical records. It matches the sign out there. So that's good. Don't have to change the sign. So consistent with historical records. All red pine, and there's again a lot of red pine chronologies. Another one from the UP that we grabbed. Not a fantastic correlation, but again, good enough. And the samples themselves correlate pretty well with one another. And so, good shot. Okay, next. So, print shop, construction date confirmed. Protar was just a few years later. Owen's house just a little bit earlier. So no Strangling era timbers in Owen's house, but Protar includes a few, of course, the print shop does. And maybe this is one of the things we want to investigate with the work we're doing this year, is, as Jim mentioned, it seemed like when we go to a structure, there's a little bit of a mix of species, but mostly this is a cedar house, this is a white pine, this is a red pine. And we want to see if we get a series of construction dates for these different buildings. Does that reflect changing availability? Like, they used all the red pine first, and they used the white pine, then they went to cedar or whatever. Well, that's preliminary floor structure. This was a ruin that we just grabbed a few logs from 2 years ago, and I actually don't know why we haven't dated that yet. I'll blame it on the students, right? Blame it on COVID. Anyway, that was cedar, and that was our first experience with cedar. We've seen a lot of cedar this year. Still to be seen, are there other extant strain-type structures? It's one of the things we want to determine this year. And we're hoping that the work that we're doing will kind of assist in determining which of these ruins should we try to take care of, which of the houses should we try to take care of, maybe this one's less historically significant, kind of like going back to the Tabernacle. Those were all just 1863, then maybe that would make it a little bit less historically significant, so tear them all out and replace them with going to be, that kind of a thing. But we hope that this will assist you in your efforts to try to preserve.
What about the
this
early?
really fascinating. Well, we don't have results for that.
We just sampled that
We just sampled.
Oh, you sampled it 2 days ago.
Yeah.
I'll tell you next year.
We wish we could just,
Oh, so the early and modern houses were sampled this year?
Yeah. That's our this year.
And the lab work takes months or
Yeah.
sometimes longer.
It's a long process.
Cool. And 2 years ago, I had a couple of students with me, and they did most of the cross-dating work. And it sounds like I'm just giving the grunt work to students. I love doing that. Jim and I were both kind of nerdy that way. We love being in the lab and working with the wood. It's just a matter of time. There's other stuff we have to do. But this material for this year is going to go to Jim's lab, and they're going to cross-date it, and we'll hopefully get you some results on those as well. And if we have to come back here every year, that's perfectly fine with us. Thanks for having us. There's my two students who came last year, and also Jim's kids helped us help us out with the important sign holding, identifying which is. Oh, there's a thank you slide after this, but the sunrise is, that's a beautiful sunrise taken from my balcony right over here. Great place to work.
Do any of you have questions?
Yeah, any questions?
I have one.
Go ahead.
Have you looked at any of James R. Fittings' work on the island?
No. You familiar with it all?
Nope.
Who is it?
James R. Fitting.
Fitting?
He was here in 1950, 1960,
Okay.
and he followed the work of someone who did some archaeological work in 1843. I have the map that shows his sites, just in case you decided to be out of the story this time.
Another note to yourself?
Katie or Ollie, do you have questions?
Yeah, check it out, he was quite an eminent
I would like Dr. Bekker's.
archaeologist.
Can you hear me?
Dr. Bekker, can you hear the?
Yes.
Okay.
You can call me that.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Katie.
Too late.
I think you just muted yourself. There you go.
I would like Dr. Bekker's contact information, please.
Sure. So Matthew, M-A-T-T-H-E-W, _Bekker, B-E-K-K-E-R, at BYU.edu.
And we can give our information to Lori too, to
Yes.
pass along.
Yes.
I didn't catch that at all.
I'll put it, Katie, I'll put it in the chat for you.
Yeah, we'll get it to you.
That's cool. Great.
So I'm curious about the reference chronologies. Where are those databases held?
Yes.
Are you,
Yeah, kind of skipped over
are they
there.
all online or?
So I imagine you're not all familiar with the International Tree Ring Data Bank. So the ITRDB is like one of, it's like the word the in our language, and that's how often we use it. So there is a repository, and this is an expectation for scientists more and more in any field, that when you do work, you save your data and you make that available for other scientists to do their work. And so there's this huge repository worldwide of all the tree ring work that people have done. And if I want to do work in archaeology or climate, as Jim mentioned, I can use those data that other people have put on the ITRDB, combine it with my data, and we can ask all kinds of really neat spatial questions. There are people who have made climate atlases based on all of the chronologies from the ITRDB. So all I did was say, okay, we've got white pine, red pine, hemlock. And I went and looked on the ITRDB and I punched in Michigan and hemlock, and Michigan and red pine. And I maybe went to Wisconsin, maybe Ontario, if I needed to. And I pulled those data, looked at the chronology, made sure it was sound, there were enough samples, made sure not to overlap with what we were doing, and then I checked the statistical correlation.
Is it saved in one place or is it distributed?
It is, it's saved in one place, anybody can access it.
Right, simple for Colorado are the
Yeah.
servers, and then we get them anywhere.
And the work that they have done in addition to its archaeological significance is added to that bank.
Right, yeah, when we're done, we'll put it on the ITR.
So that's another aspect of this, that it gets put in a world bank of all that, so it's important in two ways.
As Jim mentioned, the oldest trees on this island are in these buildings. And so if you want to do some kind of a climate analysis, there's your repository. When we're done with this work, we will put it on the ITRDB. I will access it.
What's the format of the data then? Is it images or is it CSV?
Oh,
A bunch of different.
yeah, it's nothing so modern as a CSV. There's an ancient format based on Fortran that the folks at the University of Arizona came up with, what, 40 years ago? And we still use that same format today.
What is it called?
It's Tucson format. It's literally called Tucson format.
So everything is like codified in that
Yeah,
format?
yeah. And you just pull it down and you can
Manipulate it?
manipulate it, bring it into Excel,
Yeah.
run a correlation analysis.
Ah,
There's another. Okay.
I have one for each of you. I'll start with you, Jim. So this isn't really Beaver Island related, but like, what are some of the more challenging, like maybe a very small diameter tree, like to date or analyze? Like, because when I think of Dendroarchaeology, I think of like some tree on like, you know, a windswept cliff on Lake Superior that's been there for a few thousand years, and how tough that must be to look at. Like, is that?
Yeah, they're only this big in diameter.
Right.
Yeah, cedars, like
Yeah.
cedars can be that.
A lot of the cedars,
Yeah.
they're growing really slow,
Mhm.
but they actually have really good ring development and preservation, and it's kind of this light, dark, light, dark. The difficult wood to date are the hardwoods that are around here. If you look at maple, we can see annual rings in there, but it's a wood type called diffuse porous.
Yeah.
So it has pores throughout there, but they have nothing to do with the ring boundary. So you have to look beyond 80% of the field of view in the microscope and look at the tracheids and how the cell wall thickens as you get towards the end of the year. So, and I also had a maple tree that was this big around in the understory, 20 years old, but it's missing 8 rings depending on where you look on that section. So that's very difficult. Then when you get into the tropics, it gets a lot harder, and like the wood out of Africa, we're just learning these genera, how they form rings and how they work. So they can be very hard. Yeah, if you've got cedars around here, even if they're gnarly old cedars growing on a cliff face, they tend to have pretty good ring development, and then we can date between them. And they'll be, you can have something that big that's, I did, what was that, Pine Sedulous, pinyon pine, that big around with 250 years on it. So they can be very stunted. We're starting to do work in the Arctic now, or with some Arctic shrubs. We're working with shrubs. And you can even have some things that have elongation and growth. There's a shrub, I don't know what the species is, but it grows out, it doesn't do secondary growth. And we can look at how much it grew out each year, and that actually correlates to climate.
Thank you. And then one for you, Matt. So what's like the level of awareness out in Utah and Salt Lake City, or within like BYU, of, you know, this remote area where the stray nights came up? How aware are people of Beaver Island out there?
Most people are aware of James Strang and the Strangites. I don't think they have any idea where he went. They just know that he broke off and took his group with him. So it's in any church history class you might take at BYU, it's in there, because there were all these splinter groups that took off about the time Joseph Smith was killed. So it's just one of the stories. So a colleague in my department actually has an atlas. And there's literally a little photograph and a little paragraph about Strang and Beaver Island. It shows wording on there. So that's it. Not very much.
Thank you.
You had a question?
Yeah, Question for maybe one of the people with the society, Lori or somebody else. Do we have an estimate of how many 19th century log structures there are on the island? Has that been mapped at all?
I would love to see somebody come and do a historic architecture building survey of all of the logs, structures, but I don't know what the total is.
The journal had, the first, I think it was the first issue of the Journal of History of Beaver Island, had a map of all the old structures. How many of those still exist would be really interesting.
Yeah, in the 59 years I've been coming here, I've seen probably 70% of them disappear. Yeah, or just kind of a rock pile. So that's why I wanted to get these guys here to take the last ones that are here and find out what's in it.
See, the real key is again that outer ring. That's what's exposed to the rain, the sun, and the ice.
It goes first.
And so that goes first. And once that's gone, we can give you an idea of when it's contemporary with, we can't take it with confidence that outer ring didn't cut it.
But if it's big enough or an old enough tree,
Yeah.
that group of rings can
Yeah,
help.
we can still anchor that group of rings, but we just can't tell you the precision.
Yeah.
We're all about precision, right? Not just annual, but seasonal precision, the early, the late thing. Right? So, none of this plus or minus stuff for us.
And then back to the reference chronologies. So how much variation is there? I mean, so these correlations that you come up with between southern Ontario and Beaver Island, so really the climate is that similar, that it's pretty accurate?
Yeah, so you need to think about not just the climate, but think about these being biological organisms responding to climate, and there might be something about this microsite, the soil, the ridge top, whatever, that's similar to this one that matches up. Now, to some extent, we were talking about this before we started today, that we often will use these correlations to do dendroprovenancing. That's where did these logs come from? We assume these came from Beaver Island itself. But in places like Utah, that's not necessarily the case. And usually we find that we've got 6 ITRDB chronologies. The one that is geographically closest is almost always one that has the highest correlation because it has more of the same climate. But that's not always the case apparently, which that surprised me. So many white pine chronologies, and they still correlated. They were just like, 0.25. Seems to be matching up, but not statistically significant. It wasn't until I got to that one. And those, by the way, that was an aquatic site, which means the guy was pulling logs out of the lake that were preserved in the lake. But maybe because they were next to the lake, just like these are next to a lake, maybe they had a similarity. Who was it that was talking about, you were talking about the really gnarled, windswept shoreline trees, okay. This would not be a typical dendrochronology, dendroecology site. But these seem to match in well with those, probably because they have a similar site.
Was the Ontario, well, we don't know where the logs in the water came from, right?
Yeah, no, they probably fell in, but they might have been.
Into Lake Ontario, Lake Erie? Because
Lake Algonquin.
oh, okay, that's not as big as one of the Great Lakes, because that would have a lot of effect on when they started growing in the spring, but if it wasn't one of the Great Lakes, it probably,
Some of the best preserved wood in Europe, in Finland, is in submerged in lakes. Anoxic conditions, it's not wearing out at all, so it's 1,000-year.
I wonder how much information, maybe you're already doing this, you could get from many of the something, timber ships.
They could be dated potentially.
And we're interested in looking at submerged logs, so all the logging in the late 1800s, and they floated all that through the Great Lakes, 25% of those timbers actually sunk. So today they're mining them out, and it's great old timber with very tight grain and selling it for a lot of value. We've gotten a hold of some. I worked on a lake out of Maine where they were mining timber out to slow it down, and you get these great 300-year-old logs in there, so it's great for building chronology.
I read about Daniel Walker's doing the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's great preservation. It's beautiful wood.
Are there any, do we have any 19th century old growth trees left on the island here?
Yeah, we just learned about another one recently. today, I guess.
Yeah, the,
Who's being CMU?
what is it, John Grogan? Gordon, from the CMU, the manager at CMU, the group that just started. He was telling us about an old growth forest that's near Lake.
It's kind of in this, it's not quite in the center of the island, but it's not anywhere around the perimeter. It's kind of midway, and then a third of the way in towards the center of the island. It's not in an easy access place. That's probably why it's still there, because it wasn't easy to get the logs out of there, so.
It's definitely down to a few patches of
Yeah.
wood timber. And also not the mix, so like, I haven't heard of any that's white pine or red pine that's around.
There's a couple of hemlock growths that are really early too left.
Yeah.
So is there any, desire in trying to sample any of those trees?
Yes, we're definitely interested in them, and our ecology interests and also our climate. We do all of these forms of dendrochronology, so if we can get 400-year-old chronology, we love that for the climate reconstruction for the island.
Yeah.
Of course, we'd much prefer having a red pine chronology, white pine chronology from here that overlaps, but we haven't seen anything like that yet.
But if you know of any,
Yeah,
let us know. Old pines on hand.
I mean, even, 10 trees would be enough to establish a match. Same you saw with Dylan's house.
So during museum week, CMU does some cruises, and they take them, you go down to the boathouse, and it's typically on Wednesday or Thursday of museum week. And they take you out and they drop their robot down into the water, and you can see an ancient forest. So it's pretty cool if you've never done it before. Yeah.
And that's great for us sampling as well. We've got a colleague that did that off the Gulf of Mexico. And just water change, sea level rise in different places, you can have an entire forest that's inundated, and then you have all these standing, still rooted stems, and we could sample them all in both chronology. It's a great resource for
Are
us.
the swamp
So
areas,
go back to John.
Yeah, oh, nice.
are the swamp areas on the island acidic enough to preserve trees?
Yeah, I think they would be.
Usually larch, that's kind of what you find in peat bogs.
Yeah,
Because larch doesn't rot very fast.
Right, they
They're-
really-
they grow in bogs, so they kind of,
yeah, they really need to fall in and get submerged, so if they're in the sediment, always underwater.
And they're hard to find.
Yeah, we've got a colleague, Rob Wilson, who does this in Scotland. He walks around barefoot around the edges, and you can feel them with your feet in the sediment, and then he has scuba gear.
I didn't know you had that advanced of a method that we use.
Oh, yeah.
You can find
His hobbit feet.
They found some ancient Romans that way too. Do you remember some of those bogmen that they found?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfectly preserved in bog.
Yeah.
But so acid that they didn't rot.
And then out of the southeastern U.S., they're pouring timbers out of
I
bogs.
hear about these kinds of things in any bog or lake, I've heard about that in Utah, right? I still haven't been able to find out exactly precisely, but some people have told me that there's all these trees laying in the same direction under Utah Lake to be preserved. Who knows what the species are.
Yeah, we're interested in all of that.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
gonna
Right.
walk around, stub my toe on a tree.
High-tech sampling.
When are you going to Oak Island?
Which?
When are you gonna go to Oak Island and date the money pit?
Apparently there was some dendrochronology done there, one of their shows. Somebody told me.
Thank you.
Huh?
I imagine any scientist would want to stay here, here.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.